Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about the country of Liberia and its relevance to our current political situation. So, if you're unfamiliar with Liberia, this is a country in Africa that was basically created by America as a homeland for free slaves. So, in other words, there was an organization within America called the American Colonization Society, and in 1822, they created Liberia and basically funded the repatriation of freed slaves back to Africa so that they could have a homeland there. And as we're going to talk about, America gave them basically every possible head start. So we supported them financially. We helped write their constitution. We helped write their laws. We supported them militarily. We've given them billions of dollars in aid and financial assistance over the years. And we've really been their main supporter. And despite all these advantages, this country has not flourished at all. It's actually one of the poorest and most dysfunctional countries in the world. All right, so we're going to look at why that might be the case and how that came to be. The reason this paper matters is because when we talk about race relations in America, oftentimes black people get very indignant and unhappy with white people over slavery. And the idea is they want reparations for slavery because they view this as a great injustice against them. And they think this is the reason why they're a failing population in America relative to other groups, why they have higher crime rates, why they have lower socioeconomic development compared to other groups. It's all blamed on slavery and racism more generally. And so the idea is that white people owe black people something in America. Okay, we have a great racial debt. That's the idea. And unfortunately, too many white people have embraced this idea. So you have a lot of liberal white people who have very serious white guilt, where they've bought into this story and this idea, and they believe that we need to give black people more also. And so it's being used to justify a massive wealth transfer in the form of affirmative action and diversity initiatives from white people to black people, the idea that there's a great racial injustice. But I think it's clear, and more people are realizing it, the racial injustice is actually the other way around. So, I mean, if you just look objectively at who's benefited who, white people have overwhelmingly had a net positive impact on black people, and the reverse is also true. So black people have had a net negative impact on white people. Okay, it's important that we combat this misperception because, again, this white guilt is one of the reasons that our countries are declining and why our population is suffering. Okay, so in part of my attempt to demonstrate that there's not some great racial debt that white people owe to black people, I'm going to highlight this example, which showcases something benevolent that white people did for black people that most people aren't even aware of. So most of these black people who complain about slavery and racism, they're not even aware that we basically gave them a country. And they're certainly not aware of the aftermath of that and what happened to this country. So we're going to go through that. Another reason that this paper matters is because I think it illustrates that Africans are often not great at building civilization. So if we needed more evidence of that, this case study exemplifies that. Again, we gave them basically a very similar constitution to our own, similar laws to our own, a lot of financial assistance and investment in their resource development and things like that. And they still failed. They failed to build a successful civilization. So you can put different human populations in similar starting conditions, and they'll end up at wildly different places. So this illustrates that there's something internal that is impacting these different people's ability to build civilization successfully. And so that has implications for mass immigration. Should we really be importing, millions of Africans into Europe and other white countries whenever their track record of building and maintaining a civilization is so poor? I think the obvious answer is no. Of course we shouldn't be doing that. So we're going to talk about the history of Liberia, why it failed, and again, more of why it matters. All right, so as we go through this paper, first of all, we're going to kind of skim through several papers today. So we're not going to go into too much detail on any of these, but I'm just going to focus on some of the key points that they mentioned. So first, we're going to go through the overview of the history of Liberia. So again, it was founded in 1822 by the American Colonization Society, which was an organization from the United States. And the goal was to basically return freed slaves from the Americas to Africa. And they say it eventually became a full-on country by 1847. And pretty much immediately, it descended into a sort of a tyrannical state where the freed slaves basically took all the power over the natives. So it wasn't uninhabited land. There were people living there, the natives. But the freed slaves, when they got there, they basically assumed control of the social and political system, as it says here. And they maintained that through very aggressive means that we'll talk about all the way up until the 1980s. So they don't devote much time here to that era, but we're going to talk more about it later. So these freed slaves, when they arrived in Liberia, among the first things they did was basically enslave the natives. So that's ironic. All of these, black people in our society today complaining about how white people were slave owners. Well, one, it wasn't just white people who owned slaves in America. A lot of black people owned slaves in America too, which we might talk about in future videos. But two, as soon as we sent these free black people back to Africa, they pretty much immediately started enslaving the native population, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So it's not like there were these benevolent black people who were freed and wanted to go live in peace and harmony with the other black people in Africa. No, once again, they were opportunistic. They enslaved each other, and it was all very violent. So as they say, the descendants of freed slaves, so these are the people coming back from America into Liberia, they're called Liberians, and they basically immediately became higher in status than the native population. Okay, it says down here that even though they were only 3% of the population, they maintained economic, social, and political control of the country until a coup d'etat in 1980. Okay, so that's over 100 years of history covered in like a paragraph, so they really don't do that part justice. Like I said, we're going to look at another paper in a minute that goes into that in more detail. But after 1980, or around 1980, the motive for the coup d'etat against the ruling Liberians was basically that the ruling Liberians, they were influencing the price of rice. The details aren't that important, but basically this upset the local population and caused violent revolt. And now a native, this Samuel Doe, he basically led the coup d'etat that ousted the Liberians and basically gained control of Liberia for the natives. Okay, so what happened after the natives gained control? Well, first of all, this Samuel Doe, he suspended the Constitution, but he had no formal education, and it says by many counts he was illiterate at the time he took over the presidency. So imagine that. Imagine your president is illiterate. That's what's happening in this backwards African country. Okay, he said after 1 year, Doe, concerned that his leadership was being threatened from within, executed his vice head of state and comrade in the 1980 coup. So pretty much immediately, this guy gets into power. He doesn't even know how to read. He's banning the Constitution, and then he executes his basically vice head of state. Okay, he ruled for several years until he was basically pressured to lift the ban on political parties, and he called for elections in 1985. Okay, then it says there were elections in 1985. They were considered widely problematic. That's very common for African countries. There's so much corruption, and very rarely do elections go smoothly. There's a lot of military regimes in African countries. There's a lot of coup d'etats. Elections are rarely fair in African countries. So it says, few international or local observers felt that these elections were conducted fairly, and Samuel Doe, the same guy, was named the victor. Okay. And he basically continued to be corrupt for several more years. And then there was another attempted coup d'etat. So this other group, another native group, they launched a coup d'etat against this former leader. And ultimately that produced a civil war. Again, we're not super interested in all the details of this. This is just to give you an idea mostly of the dysfunction of this country and how it's just constantly filled with corruption and violence. So again, we had basically a tyrannical state run by the freed slaves who got there, followed by a coup d'etat, and then run by an illiterate tyrant, and then followed by now a civil war. So the civil war lasted until 1996. And then basically there was another election in 1997 as part of a peace agreement to end that civil war, where this guy was declared the winner. And then there was another civil war immediately afterwards. Okay. So it says peace in Liberia, if it ever really existed, was short-lived. And then again, they give more detail on this than we really need to go into. The point is the history of Liberia is basically tyranny, coup d'etat, tyranny, civil war, rigged elections, civil war. And then finally in 2005, there were elections that were considered fair. So again, that's according to international observers. I don't know the details. It's not really that important. But the point is, after 2005, there were elections, and now it's considered relatively politically stable in Liberia. That said, it's one of the poorest countries in the world still, and it also still has forced labor, high rates of human trafficking, a lot of corruption and dysfunction. So it's by no means a good nation at this point. Okay, so to look at the economic state of Liberia, we can look at the GDP per capita ratio and then organized by country and ranked by country. So first, you look with a few exceptions. The top countries are pretty much all European countries. Again, there's some exceptions in there, or white countries. And that holds true. Eventually, you go down all the way toward the bottom and you start seeing basically exclusively African countries, again, with some exceptions. And then if you go all the way down, Liberia is 188th out of 197. So again, this is the GDP per capita. So that's an indirect measure of basically wealth per person there. So again, it's a very poor country, very dysfunctional. So now we're going to go back to this era up here. So whenever these freed African Americans first got to Liberia, what did they do? So as I mentioned, when the freed slaves first got to Liberia, one of the first things they did was enslave the natives. So again, these weren't liberated black people going back to Africa to live in peace with other Africans. Instead, they went there with the intent, or maybe not the intent, but the outcome of oppressing and enslaving the natives that they encountered. Okay. So even though this particular paper that we're about to look at, they covered an era that was later to the foundings. Remember, it was founded in 1822. The forced labor problem, which is basically just slavery, was persistent up until this point and even afterwards and even now. Okay. Child forced labor is very common still in Liberia. But we're going to look at a few examples from this paper. Okay, so starting with here, they talk about how the Americo-Liberian officials, remember that's the former slaves who are now running Liberia, they basically sent soldiers into the interior of the country to remove natives from their local tribes and pull them out to use for forced labor, namely in plantations. Okay, so that's a common theme throughout this paper. They talk about it a lot more. We don't need to go into too much detail on it. They say that it was done secretively, so it wasn't like an official policy. It was done sort of under the table. And then they say here, the Liberian government's attempt to rule the hinterland, that's like the interior of Liberia, by duplicating the time-honored British system of indirect rule failed woefully because it lacked the money, the experience, and the manpower to make it work. In other words, they tried to basically run Liberia the same way the British would run their colonies. And the British could make it work, obviously. They were experts at running colonies. But the Liberians, these Americo-Liberians, couldn't make it work. This author says it's because they lacked the money, experience, and manpower. I'm sure part of that is true, but also I think it's just a lot of its biological differences that nobody wants to acknowledge. Okay? Europeans are expert civilization builders. Not all people are. And again, this whole story illustrates that point, but nobody really talks about it from that angle. So again, the military was used to intimidate the chiefs and reduce them from royalty and pomp to lowly degradation. And as we're going to see in a minute, the military would basically, if the chiefs refused to give up workers from their tribes, oftentimes the military would like burn down their village. A lot of violence, right? But black people in America, they don't like to talk about that, probably because they don't know that that happened. But that's their ancestors doing that, or at least their kinsmen. Okay, so they give a lot more details. We're going to skip ahead to one particular quote. So it says, just to illustrate the magnitude of the problem, it says, during this period of Liberian history, it was the order rather than the exception that the indigenous population should work on government farms without payment. The Americo-Liberian officials grasped this opportunity to use the soldiers of the frontier force, that's their military, to recruit and supervise native labor on their own private farms. So again, they're using the military to extract free labor from the native populations. Okay? So just a few more points to look at in this paper before we move on. Let's see. So interestingly here, they just give sort of an example of this problem. Okay, so they say the chiefs of the native tribes were always asked to furnish a certain number of men for labor in this company. Failure to meet the deadline or the quota of men could mean imprisonment for the chief, and his villages could be burnt and raided as punishment. In some cases, the chief could be held hostage until the number of laborers requested by this is the vice president at the time, had been furnished. So again, this is just another example of corruption, oppression, enslavement, torture. So again, they weren't living in peace with the natives by any means. And if we skip ahead to the last point I want to mention from this paper, they mention that there's a significant portion of the Liberians, the native Liberians, who actually wanted to be annexed by the British at this time. In other words, they wanted to be ruled by the British instead of the African-American freed slaves who were currently running them. Okay, so when black people act like white people are terrible rulers and that black people would be able to run their own society better for themselves, evidently that's not the case. And we could look at many African societies to learn that lesson. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is look at this one last paper. We'll go through it quickly, but it speculates as to why Liberia failed. Okay, so it's an economic paper looking at the economic development of Liberia, and we're going to read some excerpts from this paper. First of all, he says that traditional economic approaches haven't worked very well when trying to advance the economies of underdeveloped countries like those in Africa and certain areas of Asia and the Middle East. He says instead of that, we need sort of more of a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just economists that are going to figure out why a given country is underdeveloped. You also have to include anthropologists, historians, sociologists, political scientists, etc. If you're going to help develop a country that's underdeveloped, you need a multidisciplinary approach. Okay, I like his inclusion of anthropology here because that implies that there might be a biological difference between these populations that is hindering their civilizational development. I think that's ultimately the answer, but he doesn't really go into that in any more detail. But we will talk about what he does say about Liberia because he makes a lot of interesting points. So he says here, Liberia is an extreme example of underdevelopment which persists because of traditional social organization, culture, and politics. Again, I think he's missing a key ingredient there, which is biology, but again, when you're talking about traditional social organization, there's plenty of societies throughout history that have functioned just fine on traditional social organization. Okay. Likewise, culture, that's probably a bigger part of it than social organization. Okay, but you got to understand that a lot of culture is actually downstream of biology. It's called gene-culture interactions. Maybe we'll look at that in future videos. And then he says politics. Again, the main thing about Liberia is that it was basically a totalitarian system. If the argument that that hinders economic production, then you have to explain why there's been numerous totalitarian regimes throughout history that have been economically prosperous. Okay, totalitarianism doesn't necessarily mean dysfunctional. It's the people, not the political system. Again, that's a lesson that Europeans need to learn. It's like the saying that demographics is destiny. Well, that is, I think, absolutely true. If you change the people, even if you were to keep all of this the same, if you were to keep the politics the same, again, remember, Liberia was given a constitution very similar to our own and laws very similar to our own. Why are we one of the most successful countries of all time and they are one of the least successful countries of all time? Maybe it has to do with the demographics. Okay, it says fewer than 10% of its population are literate, and 2/3 of its people still derive the bulk of their livelihood from subsistence activities. That means like your own personal farm. Okay. He says It's not that Liberia has no resources. He says it has a rich resource endowment relative to population. There's no land shortage. Its rainfall and soil make it highly suitable for growing tree crops. It has extremely large deposits of high-grade iron ore, which are presently being mined on a large scale. Since 1950, 4 foreign firms have invested more than $300 million in iron ore mining alone. There are known deposits of other minerals, as yet largely untapped. Liberia's iron ore and rubber are like oil and gold elsewhere, valuable export commodities, the initial exploitation of which could be made to serve as the income source for long-term private and public development outlays. So in other words, it has plenty of resources that could be extracted. The people just aren't extracting it properly. They aren't utilizing their land. And it's worth mentioning now before we get too far into it, this paper is pretty old. It's from 1965. So a lot has changed, and that's why we're not going to go into too much detail on this paper. But what hasn't changed is underdevelopment of Liberia. And so, neither has its resource availability. It still has these iron ore deposits. It's just not being utilized properly. Okay. So he goes on to talk about other reasons that Liberia isn't failing. In other words, other causes that are not responsible for Liberia's failure. He says, Liberia is the only country in Africa with which the United States has had a historical affiliation. Okay, again, that stems from the fact that the United States basically birthed Liberia and basically gave it all its laws and constitutions. So it says here, a professor from Harvard drew up its constitution on the American model in 1838, and professors from Cornell codified its laws in the 1950s. On a per capita basis, the United States government gives more aid to Liberia than to any other African country. Again, that might have changed by now, but that's at the time. And by today's money, it's been billions of dollars, maybe tens of billions of dollars have been devoted to Liberia. It's still one of the poorest, most underdeveloped countries in the world, as we saw earlier. He says, with the partial exception of Ethiopia, Liberia is the only country in Africa which was never a colony of a European power. It's been a sovereign republic since 1847. For those who are impressed by the favorite myth of African political leaders that before European colonization, Africa must have enjoyed some sort of golden age, because its present economic and social problems are the evil legacy of wicked European colonialism, an examination of Liberia is instructive. In other words, what he's saying is a lot of African leaders, and even just black people more generally, they like to attribute Africa's failed development to European colonialism, but Liberia wasn't colonized. Ethiopia was briefly colonized. Yet regardless of whether the country was colonized or not, African countries are all pretty much underdeveloped. So you can't blame Liberia's failure on colonialism. All right, it says, well, we can skip some of this, but it says from 1950 to 1962, Liberia had a high growth rate due to heavy foreign investment in iron ore and rubber, but remains largely underdeveloped otherwise. So it says the government basically mismanages money and that cost-benefit analyses are unknown in Liberian public finance. So they're just not responsible. They don't have the foresight necessary to plan government spending properly. He gives some specific details in these tables about what industries have what amount of profit in this country. Again, that's really not that important to us, especially since this is outdated by now. So we're going to skip most of the tables, but he does make a few other interesting statements that it's worth looking at. So he says, 1/4 of the wage-earning labor force, so that's basically just 1/4 of the workforce, is supplied involuntarily. Labor recruitment is a euphemism for forced labor. So even at this time, in the 60s, forced labor was still a major issue in Liberia. And like I said, it still is to this day. Okay, we could skip most of this. So he talks about how rubber is really the only commodity that Liberia is cultivating properly. He gives some reasons why above, but he also says, in contrasting it to other potential industries, he says, unlike rice, palm kernels, sugarcane, and most other cash crops grown in Liberia, rubber has no domestic use and only one domestic market outlet. If rubber could be eaten, demanded as tribute, or stolen and sold with impunity, it is unlikely that its growth rate would have been so high. Okay, he has a few more statements. Again, he says, there's neither sufficient honesty, competence, nor concern with national development among the leadership of Liberia. So again, why is Liberia not developing? Well, because the leaders don't really care about developing it. They care about getting more wealth for themselves. All right. The economic backwardness of Liberia is not attributable to lack of resources or to domination by foreign financial and political interests. The underlying difficulty is rather that the traditional Americo-Liberian rulers, for fear of losing political control to tribal people, have not allowed those changes to take place, which are necessary to develop the national society and economy. Again, I think, he's attributing basically Liberia's failure to selfishness among the rulers. I think that's part of it, but I think that's also in part a biological issue. Not all people have the same degree of altruism, and there's reason to think that might be a biological trait, which we might talk about in future videos. Okay, so he's ignoring the biological dimension of this. He basically gives some examples of mistreatment of the natives by the Americo-Liberians, but we've talked about that already, so we'll skip past this. And so he says here, Liberia had a compulsory elementary education law as early as 1912, but 50 years later, less than 10% of the population was literate. So again, how can you have mandatory education, but nobody knows how to read? Is that an organizational issue, or is it a biological issue, or is it some combination of the two? He says it has a constitution and governmental forms, executive, legislative, and judicial, modeled carefully on those of the United States, but without the remotest resemblance in actual operation. Again, why would that be the case? Because there are different people operating this with different biology, different psychology, different goals, different objectives. It has a declared policy of national unification, but in 1962, the rights and obligations of tribal persons were utterly different from those of Americo-Liberians, and 1/4 of the wage-earning labor force was recruited involuntarily, as in the harsh days of early African colonialism. Okay, and it gives some examples of political corruption. It says it had a minimum wage law, 4 cents an hour, but the law did not cover agricultural and domestic workers who comprised more than 80% of all non-governmental wage workers. So again, it doesn't matter if you give them the proper law, they're not going to put it into practice. So you could give them the same rule book that you give a different nation, and it's not going to turn out the same. All people are not interchangeable. And again, the West needs to learn that lesson. Okay, another interesting thing that he mentions is that Europeans can't become citizens or own land in Liberia. And I checked, that's still true today. So you have to be of African descent in order to gain citizenship in Liberia. How come Liberia is allowed to do that, but no European country is allowed to do that? No white country is allowed to demand ethnic heritage in order to become a citizen. Okay, but the fact that there are no Europeans there, does that make you wonder if that's part of the contributing factor to why this country is not flourishing? And he sort of implies that down here when he says, Liberia enjoyed none of the benefits of European colonialism. And by the way, there were a lot of benefits to colonialism by Europeans, which we might talk about in future videos. It says, Liberia enjoyed none of the benefits of European colonialism, which in some measure were conferred on most other African countries. This includes the building of roads, schools. I would add like railways and things like that, medicine. The benefits of trained administrators and a civil service ethic of efficient and honest performance. So again, European colonialism, Black people tend to imagine that that is holding their people back and it held their countries back from development. It's quite the opposite. Again, they were given railways, roads, schools, education, infrastructure. It improved those countries in most cases compared to what it was before and compared to what it probably would have been had they been left alone. Again, we'll probably talk about that in future videos. Okay, so that's basically it with this paper, and that's all I really wanted to talk about with Liberia. I will say this author, he argued that the main thing holding Liberia back was the leadership, the Americo-Liberians being oppressive. But remember, this paper was written in 1965, which is before the 1980 coup, where the Americo-Liberians were kicked out of power. And so it's still a terrible country. So evidently it wasn't just the fact that the Americo-Liberians were oppressive. Okay, it's just the population. They're not evidently capable of making use of their land and building a functioning civilization. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about Liberia. Again, I think it's a very good case study that people in European society need to understand, because we have this mentality that's, I think, starting to go away, but it's been dominant for so long, which is that all people are basically the same on the inside. and that you could basically replace European people with any other group, and as long as you put them in our same culture and with our same rules, they're going to produce the same society. So it doesn't matter if we get replaced. Cases like this, like the case of Liberia, demonstrate that to be completely absurd. The people running the country matter. The people operating the country at the lowest levels matter. The workers matter. Okay? Biology impacts civilization building. Again, we'll do papers on gene culture interactions in future videos, but we can't keep having this childish view that all people are the same and that they're equally able to develop a civilization. So we need to take lessons from the Liberia example and use that as reason to restrict immigration from certain areas into European civilization, and to argue in favor of remigration, mass deportation of these people out of our civilization. They're not going to make things better. And we have mountains of evidence that that's the case. So we don't want to become the next Liberia. Thanks for listening.